Alright, so for about the last 3 weeks, I've been playing Azalea during the ProQuest season. Main part of this was a bit of a comfort pick. It's what I practiced for US Nationals this year. And I didn't really have a hero that I really wanted to play during the ProQuest season. And I also think that Azalea's matchup spread is theoretically pretty powerful. Looking at the data from week 1 of ProQuest season, we see Aurora, Enigma, and New all kind of pop up in the top decks, and then going into week 2, it's mainly the same. Enigma and Aurora are still considered to be the best decks in format, with Florian and Viscera tagging along. So out of all of these, I think New is the only problem matchup for Azalea. New has a lot of ways to target your hand, your arsenal. They can hand rip you, they can remove multiple cards, they can also play incredibly defensive, and you don't have any armor to block with, so whenever you're put into a position where you need to block, you normally can't. But the rest of these matches, in my opinion, I think are actually very good for Azalea. So Aurora, I think if you have the right tech, can be favored for you. I think Enigma is pretty close to 50-50, if not slightly leaning more in your favor, in my opinion, and I think that the rest of the Rune Blades are pretty easy as well. Even Florian being more earth and defense orientated, I actually think that that matchup is perfectly fine. And in addition, I think Azalea also beats basically everything that I would consider to be in tier 2 or below her. So everything down here, I also think that you're doing perfectly fine into. Over the past 3 weeks, I have managed to somehow get top 4 every single ProQuest, which is a feat considering how big some of these events are. Like the one last night, this is the morning after recording, I think it was like 50 people in the Seattle scene, lots of really competitive players, very good players. I'm glad that I was able to be consistent enough with the deck to get top 4 every single time. However, it has been a long, painful process of just missing greatness with Azalea every single time. So for anyone who remembers an old tournament recap from Nationals, I missed my win-in for caching top 64 in Nads. I lost my win-in starting 5-0 into 5-3. At the Battle Harden, which was like 600 plus players, I think, the largest Battle Harden, I think, in Fab history. And all I needed to do was clutch any one of those wins and I would make top 8 at that, which is a huge feat, and somehow couldn't manage to do it. And then 6 days later, back in Tacoma, like right outside of Seattle, we had the Battle Harden SeaTac, where I managed to go a 4-2 and bubble out of top 8. So my record performance has been good, like above average with Azalea, but somehow unable just to like clutch out like that victory, which is like really frustrating. Maybe I'm playing this at like 90% efficiency, and maybe, you know, the 95 and higher players know something I don't, or she could just be poorly positioned, or maybe it's just variance. This deck can really, to put it frankly, shit itself sometimes. Like my loss in top 4 the previous week, so week 2 of ProQuest season, I was in top 4 against an Aurora. They attacked me to make an embodiment on turn 1. I block out, and then I draw 2 Rain Razors, 2 pumps, and the game is like literally over. And also, I think she does have pretty bad matchups. I lost in top 4 to Pankaj, Ethnic Smoke, in week 1 on New, which I think is a bad matchup, so it's unlucky I hit that in the top 4 bracket. And then last night, I hit Victor in top 4, which is like, you know, that one's giga cursed. So it could be that I'm missing some like really small margins on like theory and, you know, performance. It could also just be unlucky, you know. I'm not going to think about it too hard because I don't think anyone's ever going to play Azalea again next month with Jarl coming out. But in the hopes that maybe someone is looking to pick her up or wants a bit of a refresher going into the last week of ProQuest season, it's draft for me, but it might be CC for you. I will run through the list here. So everything here is stock standard. This list is almost basically solved. Brody Spurlock, I think, is probably the pioneer of this deck, specifically playing more on yellows and really trying to not pitch very often, or to pitch as efficiently as possible. And so we have the most standard equipment set ever. The only thing I'll note is halfglove has way more relevancy now. Almost everyone is playing warmongers. Even Aurora is playing warmongers, which is absolutely bizarre to me, but you know, it is what it is. You're going to play this into a lot of matchups nowadays. You're going to play this into Enigma, maybe Assassin if you read that they're going to be on Warmongers. I think most Assassins are going to be on Warmongers. You're going to play this into Aurora. You're going to play this in the Mirror. In the Mirror, you know, it has a lot of good equity. You're able to block with it, and then you're able to play through Red in the Ledger, which is really important. The matchup is absolutely cursed. I really don't like the Mirror. It's probably like one of my least favorite mirrors in Fab. You have no agency in blocking, both because of Dominate and the fact you don't have blocking equipment. Halfglove at least lets you play through 1 Red in the Ledger because you get redded by your opponent, and you at least can buff an arrow by 4 and send it if you're making sure you're always arsenaling arrows in that matchup. But overall, honestly, Halfglove has made Warmongers feel pretty irrelevant most of the time. Your main hope is that the first Warmongers they play You either half glove or snaps, and then the second one you do either or, right? So ideally you like have an arrow and arsenal, so try to arsenal arrows a lot if you're assuming you're playing into a deck playing warmongers, because they warmongers you and you can at least go arrow from arsenal, snaps, reload off of your death dealer since it's a weapon action, reload a second arrow and then play it. And you normally at least get to present like anywhere between 8 to maybe 10 damage with on hits into warmongers, which is really good for you. That's a really good punish for it. And then half glove usually on the second warmongers, and the hope is that they never see the third one or they have to block with the third one. That's normally my experience, is normally most decks don't get to resolve all 3 copies against you. They normally get to resolve 1 to 2. The only thing that's maybe out of place here is Spellfray Cloak. I lost both one-in-ins in the Battle Hardens to Kano. One of them was to Majin Bay, and Spellfray Cloak would have won me the game, unfortunately. And then the next week I actually did lose the one that I needed for Breakers to Kano as well. So I started including this, but the problem is Kano has kind of dipped off because of the tome ban. So I really don't know if you need this anymore. It's just a consideration if you want it. For the actual list here, this is all stuff you've seen before. I really don't think anything here is out of place, but we can run through it for people who are newer to Azalea. So the main goal of this list is you're trying to pitch only a yellow or use your tunic counter to play all of your cards. You normally would like to avoid ever having to pitch a red to play something. That's really what this is trying to do. So if we look at our actual stats here, we're on 16 yellows. More often than not, about 75% of the time, we're drawing a yellow in hand, which is exactly what we want. We want a yellow and a 1 cost ideally. And then that small margin where you're not drawing yellows is ideally turns where you have Tunic up and you can load and play a 0 cost. So because all the pumps are so premium, like Lace with Blood Rot is a 0 for 3 with an on hit for 2 damage, so this is basically a 0 for 5 go again. All the laces are insane. They're all incredibly powerful. You have take aims to also help you extend a bit of your reach, but the idea is that all of these are so strong that they're all basically head jabs. If you ever have to pitch one of these, you're incredibly down on your turn. What you want to do is you want to abuse the fact that Death Dealer refunds your card, and if you're on Tunic, you're actually up a card, because if you just load Endless Arrow or any of these 0 costs with Tunic, draw a card and then play 4 pumps, like you actually go up a card. It's incredible, because ideally your hand is like 3 pumps and an endless and a pump and arsenal. You play it and then you get to load the endless off the Tunic and then drop all the pumps onto it. So this deck will never be able to exist again once ice comes back in, basically. Frostbite's completely wrecked its curve to some degree. You'll probably have to start siding in blues or just change out the actual ratios in the deck to play blues, which is a bummer because our yellows are actually really powerful in this deck. So we get to play codexes, of course, and these let us load our 1 costs in, and then with the 1 resource, obviously we just fire it off. So your yellows are your resource curve for your 1 cost, and then Tunic is mainly your resource curve for your 0 cost. So you kind of want to balance a bit between doing those 2 different things. In terms of the arrows, we're just playing all the ones with really premium on hits. We're not going to play, anything that doesn't have a really impactful on hit unless if it really accomplishes something important for the deck. So Read the Glide Path doesn't actually provide on hit for its buff, but the ability to opt is really good. So either you're going to want to play this from Arsenal and see what you're going to draw off Death Dealer before you commit to the Death Dealer. So let's say you need a pump for Death Dealer when you're going to load your arrow and you see an arrow on top, you get the benefit of being able to opt and then trying to draw a more relevant card. Or you're going to play it and then fish for a card to Azalea in. Something I should mention is that using Azalea is really important for this deck. You're going to use it basically almost every single turn, and you're never usually trying to fish for dominate unless if you're in a very specific matchup, because a lot of the time what you can do is if you have an arrow in hand and an arrow in arsenal and you see a buff on top of your deck, you're just going to flip the buff in with Azalea to play it and then load your arrow with Death Dealer to draw a new card, ideally another buff. Ideally, you're stacking as many buffs onto 1 arrow as possible and normally leaving an arrow left over to arsenal. And so Read the Glide Path definitely does that well. Take Aim is really important. It lets you fix a lot of really bad hands in the deck, specifically all non-attack hands, for example. If you have no arsenal, when this deck has no arsenal, you are really opening up the chance for variants to screw you over, basically, because a really important thing is being able to opt, right? So if you have no arrows in hand, but you have a card in arsenal, you get to opt once. If it's not an arrow, you get to sink it, and then you get to Azalea again. So you're having 2 more looks, and based on the ratios of the deck, you hopefully should be finding an arrow at that point, or something like a Codex of Frailty that essentially acts like an arrow. Take Aim will let you do that because if you draw 4 non-attacks with no arsenal, you can at least drop a card in arsenal to flip to cross wrap, to opt, and then to Azalea in. So it fixes a lot of things. It also lets you play the Bolden Shot really well, because if your opponent blocks out your loaded Bolden Shot to deny the reload, if you've already used Death Dealer, then you can just go ahead and play the take game anyway. Really impactful lines are going to involve Endless Arrow in take game, so being able to fire the Endless Arrow even if you've used Death Dealer, and even if you don't have access to Bullseye Bracers, whether that's because of the arm piece you're running or if you've already used it, being able to snap the Endless Arrow when it goes back to your hand to play take game on it and reload it and fire it again for 7. So sick. So take game is really strong, so that's the idea, right? All the other prompts we want on hits, all the other arrows we want on hits, but some of these are really impactful for the overall strategy, and we're more than happy to play them. Another really nice thing about these yellows, specifically Rain, Codex, and Codex of Bloodrot, is the fact that these pitch themselves naturally, but they're also really powerful endgame closers. Codex of Bloodrot specifically comes to mind, removing a blocking choice from your opponent while also presenting them 2 damage. This card is really powerful to play in the early game as well. It's essentially take game, but it refunds itself with a Ponder and also gives yourself a Bloodrot. It can also come at the cost of messing with your opponent's hand a little bit, specifically if they want to put a D-React in Arsenal. Really clean line is you play your Codex of Bloodrot, and if you're in a matchup where they're on D-Reacts, you're going to side and release attention as a pump. And then that way, you basically remove an entire choice from them. And if you combine that with a Seek and Destroy or an Inertia on hit, you can just absolutely push yourself ahead in terms of game lead. Rain Razors is really synergistic if you're playing this on a Bolden Shot turn, or a turn where you're going to snaps into Codex, trying to get 4 up to 6 value on this. Really powerful with Endless Arrow, of course, that's like the best example. Pitching this naturally as your resource curve means that late game you have really good pushing potential for lethal. Your opponent has to play around these in the end game. Knock is here because you go first sometimes, and if you draw Knock on turn 1, most of the time you're going to win the game. Murkmire Grapnel is sided in now that Enigma is so popular. This used to be Yellow Spire sniping, but if Enigma is going to be around, why not go up to 5 copies of Murkmire, because this card is what wins that matchup, and that's honestly why I think that Enigma is perfectly fine for you as Azalea right now. So including this in your resource curve is more than adequate. If you ever want to dominate this in, it's pretty easy to pay for the aim counter, and then it becomes a 0 for 4 with dominate, which is like perfectly reasonable for what the deck wants to do. And then we're going to go into the sideboard of what I played. So what I played for this weekend was a mix of a few things. So we have Hamstring Shot. I think that this is the most important card against Aurora. I think if you're having trouble with Aurora as Azalea and you're not running this card, I would probably pinpoint that this is probably the reason you're struggling with the matchup. Aurora sometimes doesn't want to pitch at all. There are some hands where she will have a blue, and so her plan is to swing weapon and make an embodiment, and on those turns you're removing 2 damage because now she can't afford to swing the weapon in that curve. But the Aurora lists are really low on blues. I think they're around like 9 or so, anywhere between like 9 to 12. So a lot of the hands, they're playing red line, they're playing Cheerios, and if you hamstring shot them, you're removing an entire card, which is probably worth like 4 or more in Aurora. That on hit is absolutely brutal, especially if they're planning to block down to 2 cards and play like a really efficient 2 card hand, something like E-Strike or Snatch. Now they have to keep an entire extra card just to do that line, and that normally means they're leaking even more damage through. I think this card absolutely hoses Aurora, and I think that you need to include it if you're worried about it, which you should be based on the numbers. Some other applications would be Azalea, any aggro deck really, except for probably Dio. Dio has access to a lot of blues and resources and Tekla Foundry Heart, so I really wouldn't bother running it in that matchup. It's also really good in the mirror, right? Because we talked about how even one Frostbite completely wrecks the curve of this deck. Of course, you always can pitch a yellow to load a 0 cost, although that kind of sucks. It will happen, and so that's where Hamstring Shot is the less good in the mirrors if they have access to Tunic and they're able to pitch their yellow to load their 1 cost, float their Tunic, and play anyway. So try to not play this when they have Tunic up. If they don't have Tunic up, you're like, this card absolutely excels in the mirror, although obviously in the mirror you always want to fish for Rend the Ledger. Rend the Ledger is like the main card in that matchup. You just have to preserve so many copies of it, try to resolve more than your opponent, get more codexes in your opponent so that you play more copies of Rend the Ledger. The mirror is absolutely a hellscape, but Hamstring Shot does add some extra interaction in the matchup when you're not finding Rend the Ledger. You need to find as much disruption as possible. I've also discovered that running it into Victor is actually surprisingly pretty good because their curve is actually tight if they're playing with Tunic and Pummel. So for instance, they can't block down to 2 cards to go blue, Tunic, and send Chokeslam. They have to keep an extra card, which means they have to leak more damage. It means that they can't CNC Pummel off of 3 cards with Tunic. Also means that they can't send things like Cranial into you, right, without having to float Tunic or keep an extra card. And you just cut Rend the Ledger against Victor for this, so it's not a big deal, but I was actually really impressed with how this card performed. And it's probably the only reason I even got my Victor opponent down to 1 and like barely lost to Macho Grande by like over 2 damage. So it was really insane, which is even more crushing that we lost that matchup. But Hamstring Shot actually felt good every time I played it. So I think it may be worth exploring some more. I think this card is really powerful. And then the rest of this is a mix of just good sideboard options as well as a lot of Enigma hate. So we see Murkmire Grapnel in red, of course. We have Release Attention and Remorseless. This is also why I think that you're doing perfectly fine into defensive Florian lists, like mid-range Florian. The mix of Release and Remorseless means that their D-Reacts are just not going to work, and that also means that turns off their Decompose, because most of the time they're only D-Reacts or Rootbound Carapace, so if those are in Arsenal, you absolutely blow them out. Remorseless is also really good in the mirror. You side in Remorseless into every single matchup where Infecting Shot is less damage. So if Infecting Shot is a 1 for 7 and you think that they're going to lose 3 life off of Remorseless most of the time, you just swap it for Remorseless. It's a really easy cut, but into defensive lists you also want to play Remorseless. So you play these into Enigma, of course, play all of these. You know, I actually do keep Infecting Shot for Enigma, which is really important in my opinion, but you know, you're only siding in 6 cards here, so it's pretty easy, right? Like, you know, you just swap the Murkmires with any of the 0 costs, and then you drop all these in, and you can cut 1 arrow of your choosing. Most of the time for me, I usually opt to cut like 1 Rend the Ledger. You just really value turning off their D-React so that they can't actually protect the mirror guy or most of their ward. And then we have Sleep Dart. Sleep Dart's like kind of interesting. It was really good to a lot of heroes, specifically KO. It's lost a bit of its edge over time. And I don't really know exactly if I actually still want to be running it currently. It is kind of cool into the Earth heroes if they're planning to make auras during their turn. It can be good in the mirror because you turn off the ability for the Azalea to flip, which means that knock doesn't work in the mirror if you have Sleep Dart out. So I do kind of like its application. Turning off Aurora from being able to make embodiments during her turn is also nice, but I think with the decline of KO, this card gets a lot worse. If we look at this spreadsheet, this card doesn't really do too much into the top set of heroes, but the biggest thing for me is Viscerai. I think Sleep Dart is like on par with Rend the Ledger into Viscerai, and so I really still want to play it. So it's still in my list of 3 copies because of Viscerai. Something I should also mention is with the inclusion of Dio, it's also why I left it in here. Turning off Dio's hero ability is so insane, and so like that will win you the game pretty much. Like removing her extra card draw for the turn, which also removes her potential action point, her potential +4 damage with Boom Grenade, or her extra draw with Processor. I think that's really nuts personally, and so I'm still keeping in Sleep Dart, and then we're siding in Withering Shot for this weekend, right? For my weekend at least, because of Dio. If you give them the Frailty token, they're planning for a high octane turn, you're potentially saving yourself 6 life on it, right? Which is pretty nuts. Like that's a 1 for 11, assuming they don't even play an attack from Arsenal, and then it's a 1 for 12. So that's the overall list. You're a really aggressive tempo deck. I think this deck honestly embodies all the things I don't like about Flesh and Blood, to be perfectly honest. It reminds me of a much weaker version of Starvo, where you dominate the damage and it's so egregious, but yet also the on-hits are so punishing for you. Now, I think this deck has less crazy on-hits than Starvo, because Starvo's on-hits literally didn't let you play the game. But this deck is incredibly strong, but the problem is you always have to keep the tempo up, and so that requires a lot of good arsenal management. You're going to be in a lot of spots where sequencing is pretty important. Knowing when to Azalea flip and when it's actually correct to blind is definitely a skill that maybe is like the 5% skill margin I'm missing. I do feel like I'm pretty comfortable with it, knowing kind of my gut, and also, you know, obviously, yeah, logical deduction when it's like correct to be using that hero power. For certain circumstances, whether or not we're fishing for an arrow, fishing for a pump, whether or not we're looking for an out off the top, knowing what cards are left in deck, that could be absolute bricks. Like if you're holding arrows and you have the potential to flip into Codex of Frailty, you know, do you want to take that risk? It's a hard deck for sure. I'll probably put some gameplay up on the channel, maybe just like 1 game for fun if people also want a refresher on it. And then when we go into the maybe board, these are some other cards I've considered that I have cut over time. So week 1, I was playing Fatigue Shot, mainly just because I thought people were still going to play KO. That was incredibly incorrect. So if your local meta is still on KO or Victor, Fatigue Shot is very good. But personally for me, there was just no reason to play it. So going into week 2, I swapped out for Sedation Shot. This was specifically for the Earth heroes as well as Aurora. Aurora normally ends her turn with a lot of card draw, so that way she can set up the 5-card hands with Embodiment and usually CLV. Or, you know, she plays Snatch at the end of her turn, or she'll play Gone into Flash, bounce it, and then Arsenal it. So Sedation Shot is actually very good into her. It's also very good into the Earth heroes, right? If you stick Release Attention on it, dominate it. and then you get to clear out their D-React. Not only are you leaking damage, turning off their D-React, which is inherently powerful in the matchup where you can go down to fatigue sometimes, but the fact that you're also, once again, removing their ability to decompose is the most important part. And for that same reason, I've also considered Dreadbore into the Earth Heroes. If you can turn off their D-Reacts from Arsenal and their D-Reacts from hand, they like basically can't decompose into you. I know that they'll still play Felling and Crown, but you're removing half of the cards in their deck that normally decompose. Most lists I've seen are running anywhere between 3 and 6 Carapace. So if you're able to knock basically 6 of their decomposed cards out and only put them on Felling and Plow to decompose, I think you're tremendously up in the matchup. However, Death Dealer drawing a card is always broken, so it's a hard call to make. But yeah, so these are my cuts. So I was running these 2 ofs, and it was Fatigue Shot week 1, Sedation Shot week 2, and now we were on Withering Shot for week 3. Going into week 4, I'm assuming Withering Shot is probably still the correct hit. Like, you need 5 cards for Dio. These are so important for her. You basically cover your entire matchup spread. If we look over here, Withering Shot is also really good into New, turns off the daggers, which is like good conversion, especially if you dominate. So looking at this, like, we have Rune Blades, we have Enigma, and we have some more defensive heroes and disruptive ones, and I think that this sideboard pretty much covers everything, especially for including Dio. Like, Dio gets hosed by these ones right here, your Sleeps and your Witherings, as well as Remorseless. The Rune Blades get wrecked by Hamstring, Remorseless, and, you know, Viserai gets wrecked by Sleep Dart. Specifically, Enigma loses to Murkmire, Release, and Remorseless, and then into New, your Release, Remorseless, and your Withering Shots are very good. So I think that overall, like, that sideboard has like the most equity into the super generalized meta. But if you know your own local meta better, you can make much better arrow selections, because like Azalea is only as good as her on hits are. And in some metas, like Rend the Ledger does literally nothing, right? So it's all up to you to decide what you want to do. But that was my overall experience playing the hero this season. Based on my own performance, I can kind of see why she's like lagging behind a little bit, despite the fact that I played well and have reps on the deck and had some kind of favorable matchups and some bad ones. It still has, you know, been the same since Nationals, where the deck feels good, but it doesn't feel like it can always get there. And that, once again, could be pilot error, or it could just be the deck itself. So give it a run. If you're playing this weekend, let me know how it goes. Until next time, thank you for watching.